The night I had my husband arrested, he was lying in another woman's bed, probably feeling quite pleased with himself, wearing the very same cologne I'd bought him for our last anniversary. I know that detail because the police report was meticulous. It described the scent of expensive sandalwood and the rustle of silk sheets, the kind of things a man like Derek thought he deserved without ever having to earn them. There were champagne glasses on the nightstand, still half full, and a woman named Tanya Richardson screaming at the top of her lungs as the officers moved into the apartment with their weapons drawn. My husband, Derek Fontaine, tried to explain. Oh, he always had an explanation. He had spent 12 years building a marriage on a foundation of elaborate stories, twisting reality until I couldn't tell which way was up or down. But this time, his silver tongue couldn't save him. His explanations didn't mean a lick of difference because I had something he didn't expect: documentation. I had 5 days of GPS tracking data, screenshots of his location history, and most importantly, the title to my car showing my name, and only my name. I had filed a police report 12 hours earlier reporting that vehicle stolen by my estranged husband who had taken it without my permission. When those officers showed him the paperwork, when they explained that he was being arrested for grand theft auto, Derek Fontaine finally stopped talking. It was the most satisfying silence I have ever heard in my entire life. But before I tell you how we got to those handcuffs and those silk sheets, you need to understand who I am. My name is Simone Fontaine. I am 38 years old, born in Baltimore, Maryland, the second daughter of a mechanical engineer and a pediatrician who immigrated from Ghana back in 1982. My parents didn't raise me to be a victim, they raised me to be practical. In our house, you thought before you acted. You weighed the evidence. You never, ever made a decision based on emotion alone. My father used to say that a bridge built on feelings would collapse in the first storm, but a bridge built on math and stone would stand for 100 years. For 12 years of marriage, I'm ashamed to say I ignored every bit of that advice. I let what I thought was love override every rational instinct in my body. I let him tell me I was being too sensitive or too analytical. But on the night I tracked my car to apartment 7B at 2847, Willow Creek Drive, something inside me finally snapped into place. I stopped being the wife who believed the stories, and I became the woman who collected the evidence. Let's go back to the beginning, because every bad ending starts with a very convincing beginning. I met Derek Fontaine at a charity gala in Washington, D.C. in October of 2011. I was 25 then, just a girl with a fresh promotion to project manager at a consulting firm, wearing a dress I'd borrowed from a friend and trying my best not to look as out of place as I felt. The room was filled with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, and there he was. He was 31, confident, and devastatingly handsome, the kind of man who made women turn their heads just to see him walk by. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, or so he said. He made good money, drove a sleek car, and had a smile that could light up a dark alley. He approached me at the bar while I was ordering a club soda. He didn't use a cheesy pickup line. He just leaned in and said, "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." I laughed, caught off guard. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's feeling the same way, he said, extending his hand. Derek Fontaine. And you are? Simone Chabi. And yes, I would rather be home watching Netflix. He gave me a warm, genuine laugh that made me feel like I was the only person in that crowded ballroom. Tell you what, Simone. Give me 30 minutes to convince you this gala is worth your time. If I fail, I'll personally escort you to your car and apologize for wasting your evening. I gave him those 30 minutes. Then I gave him 2 hours. By the end of the night, I gave him my phone number. We were married 14 months later. In the early years, things were good, or at least, I convinced myself they were. Derek traveled frequently for work, sometimes 3 or 4 days a week. I missed him, of course, but I understood it. He was building a career, he was providing for our future. Or so the story went. I was building my own career, too. I made partner at my firm by 32, one of the youngest in the company's history. I was the one who bought our house in Silver Spring, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with a big backyard and a 2-car garage. The house was in my name. The down payment came from my savings, and the mortgage was paid from my salary. Derek told me it made more sense that way because his credit was a bit complicated from some bad decisions he'd made in his 20s. I didn't question it. I was in love, and I trusted my husband. When it came time to buy the 2019 Mercedes E-Class, we did the same thing. It was titled in my name because Derek said the insurance would be cheaper. Again, I didn't question it. I should have questioned everything. The signs were there like cracks in a foundation, if only I had been willing to look down. There were the phone calls he took in the other room, the work trips that always seemed to fall on our anniversaries or holidays, and the credit card charges that didn't quite match the business expenses he claimed. But every time a flicker of doubt rose up in my chest, Derek had an explanation ready. The phone calls were confidential client talks. The weekend trips were mandatory conferences. The charges were team-building dinners. I believed him every single time because believing him was easier than facing the truth. Admitting my marriage was a lie would mean admitting I had wasted a decade of my life. So I stayed quiet, I ignored my gut, and I pretended everything was fine. I played the part of the happy wife until January of 2024, when my husband sat across from me at breakfast and asked to borrow my car. "Mine's in the shop," he said, casually buttering his toast. "Something's wrong with the transmission. They need it for at least a week." "A week?" "That's a long time," I replied, a small knot forming in my stomach. "I know, but it's a complicated repair. I'll need your car to get to work." I hesitated. I had my own meetings, my own life to manage. But Derek was already reaching for my keys on the hook by the door. "I'll be careful with it, I promise," he said. He kissed me on the cheek, a quick, cold gesture I'd stopped analyzing years ago, and walked out the door. I watched him pull out of the driveway in my Mercedes, and for the first time in 12 years, I didn't let the feeling go. That evening, I did something I had never done. I opened the tracking app on my phone. My car had a built-in GPS system, something I'd installed for emergencies but never actually used. I typed in my password, my fingers trembling slightly, and watched the screen load. A small blue dot appeared on the map, pulsing gently. My car wasn't at Derek's office. It wasn't at a repair shop. It was parked at an apartment complex in Bethesda, 2847, Willow Creek Drive. I stared at that, for a long time. I tried to think of an explanation. Maybe he was visiting a friend? Maybe there was a meeting there? But as the hours ticked by and the dot didn't move, the truth started to feel very heavy. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark living room of the house I had paid for, and I realized that the time for explanations was over. It was time for the truth. You know, there's an old saying back in Gunna that my grandmother used to whisper when things got difficult. The person who is going to bite you is usually the one wearing your own clothes. She meant that the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers in the street. They come from the people you let into your kitchen, the ones you share your bed with, the ones who know exactly where your heart is softest. My parents brought that wisdom with them when they landed in Baltimore in 1982. They arrived with 2 suitcases, a medical degree, an engineering license, and a backbone made of iron. My mother, the pediatrician, spent her days healing children and her evenings making sure her own daughters understood the value of $1 and the necessity of a sharp mind. My father, the engineer, looked at the world as a series of structures. To him, everything had a load-bearing capacity. If you put too much weight on a weak beam, it didn't matter how pretty you painted the house, it was going to come down. I remember sitting at our heavy oak dining table every Sunday evening. My father would pull out his ledger, and my mother would review the week's patient charts. They taught us that life wasn't just something that happened to you, it was something you managed. They were practical people, immigrants who couldn't afford the luxury of being flighty or emotional. If you had a problem, you didn't cry about it, at least not until you'd written down 3 possible solutions. Simone, my mother would say, her accent still thick and musical, a woman's greatest asset isn't her beauty or her kindness. It is her independence. Never let a man be the only person who knows where the money is kept, and never let him be the one who tells you who you are. I'd nod and smile, a teenager more interested in my books and my dreams than in warnings about men. I thought I knew better. I thought that because I was smart and successful, I was immune to the traps other women fell into. I looked at my parents' marriage, a partnership of mutual respect and shared labor, and I assumed that's just how it worked. I didn't realize that Derek Fontaine wasn't looking for a partner, he was looking for a platform. Derek was the opposite of my father. Where my father was quiet and calculated, Derek was loud and spontaneous. Where my father spoke in facts, Derek spoke in possibilities. In those early years, I mistook his lack of structure for freedom. I thought his complicated finances were just a side effect of a man who lived life to the fullest, not a symptom of a man who lived life on someone else's dime. Looking back, I can see how I slowly dismantled the stone and math bridge my father told me to build. I started making excuses for Derek almost as soon as the ink was dry on the marriage certificate. When he didn't contribute to the mortgage, I told myself he was investing in his business. When he didn't have money for dinner, I told myself I was the higher earner, so it's only fair. I was using my success to mask his failures, effectively building a facade that even I started to believe in. But that gun of wisdom stayed buried deep in my marrow. You can try to paint over the truth, you can try to ignore the creaking of the floorboards, but eventually, the weight becomes too much. My parents watched us. They stayed quiet, as they'd later tell me, because they knew that a woman like me had to see the collapse for herself before she'd be willing to move out of the rubble. They raised me to be a project manager before I ever knew what the job title meant. A project manager looks at a timeline, identifies the risks, and creates a contingency plan. For 12 years, I let Derek manage the project of our marriage, and he ran it straight into the ground. But he forgot one very important thing. I was the one with the credentials. I was the one who knew how to document a failure. And as I sat in that dark living room in Silver Spring, watching that little blue GPS dot pulse in Bethesda, I felt my father's engineering mind and my mother's clinical coldness take the wheel. The Simone who loved Derek was gone. The Simone who was raised to be practical, the daughter of Ghana who knew that a bite from a loved one hurts the most, was wide awake. I wasn't just going to get mad. I was going to get organized. When I look back at the photos from that night in October 2011, I see a woman who was a stranger to me. My hair was pulled back in a tight, sensible bun, and I was wearing a navy blue silk dress that I'd pinned at the waist because it was a size too big. I looked like what I was, a young professional who had mastered the art of the spreadsheets but hadn't quite figured out how to breathe in a room full of people who spent more on their shoes than I spent on my rent. That gala was for a children's hospital, held at one of those grand hotels in D.C. where the ceilings are gold-leafed and the air smells like lilies and desperation. I was standing by the mahogany bar, clutching a club soda like a lifeline, calculating exactly how much longer I had to stay to satisfy my boss's expectations. I was doing the math in my head, 15 more minutes of mingling, 5 minutes to find my coat, and I could be on the metro home by 10. That's when I felt him. Some people have a presence that precedes them, a kind of atmospheric shift. Derek didn't just walk up to me, he occupied the space around me. He was tall, with a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. "You're doing it again," he said. His voice was a rich, smooth baritone that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. I turned, startled. "Doing what?" "Counting," he said, leaning one elbow on the bar. He had these eyes, dark, intelligent, and focused entirely on me. "You're counting the minutes until you can leave. You've checked the clock on the wall twice in the last 60 seconds, and you're gripping that lime wedge like it's a getaway car." I felt a flush creep up my neck. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to a professional," he laughed. He didn't look away. Most men in that room were scanning the crowd for someone more important to talk to, but Derek looked at me like I was the only person in the building. "I'm Derek. And I'm currently at 22 minutes myself. I made a bet with my colleague that I could find the most interesting person in the room before the clock hit 30. I think I just won." It was a line. I know that now. It was a perfectly crafted, high-test hook designed to catch a woman who felt overlooked. But at 25, it didn't feel like a line. It felt like being seen. "I'm Simone," I said, finally letting go of my drink. "And I hate to break it to you, Derek, but I'm just a project manager who'd rather be in pajamas. I'm not sure I qualify as interesting." "A project manager," he mused, tilting his head. "So you're the one who makes sure the world actually works while the rest of us are daydreaming." That's the most interesting thing I've heard all night. He spent the next 30 minutes asking me questions. Not the usual "what do you do?" and "where are you from?" nonsense. He asked me what I was reading. He asked me what my parents' first meal was when they moved to America. He listened, really listened, nodding as I talked about my father's engineering projects and my mother's clinic. He made me feel like my practical, sensible life was a grand adventure. When the 30 minutes were up, he didn't leave. He stayed for 2 hours. He told me about his work in pharmaceutical sales, describing it not as a job, but as a mission to get life-saving medicine to people who needed it. He spoke about his travels, his dreams of building something that lasted, and his old-fashioned values. "I'm a simple man, Simone," he told me as we stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. "I believe in hard work, loyalty, and finding one person to build a life with. Everything else is just noise." I looked at him, silhouetted against the DC skyline, and I thought I had found the exception to every rule. My mother had warned me about men who talk too much, but Derek didn't just talk, he charmed. He made me feel like his success was inevitable and that he wanted me to be the foundation of it. As he walked me to my car that night, the air was crisp and smelled of autumn leaves. He waited until I was safely inside, locked the door, and tapped twice on the glass with a smile. I drove home with my heart racing, thinking about how lucky I was. I didn't see the trap. I didn't see that he wasn't looking for a foundation to build with, he was looking for a foundation to build on. He had spent that night analyzing me just as much as I thought I was analyzing him. He saw the achiever in me. He saw the woman who took pride in taking care of things, the woman who would work twice as hard to fix a problem rather than admit it was unfixable. He didn't fall in love with Simone Achabi, he fell in love with the security I represented. And like any good salesman, he knew exactly how to close the deal. I didn't know then that the man on the balcony was a character he played. I didn't know that the simple man with loyal values was already calculating how long it would take to get his name on my accounts. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, I felt like the lead character in a story, and I was too dazzled by the spotlight to notice the shadows moving in the corners. You know, looking back, I realized that Derek moved with the precision of a master gardener. He knew exactly when to water the relationship and exactly when to prune my doubts before they could grow. We call it a whirlwind romance because that's exactly what it does. It kicks up so much dust and debris that you can't see 2 feet in front of your own face. Our first few months together were a blur of weekend getaways, expensive dinners that he insisted on paying for, back then, anyway, and constant, fluttering attention. He'd send flowers to my office on a random Tuesday just because the sun reminded him of my smile. He'd call me at lunch just to hear my voice. To a woman raised on a diet of logic and hard work, this felt like a fairy tale. I thought I had finally found the one thing my spreadsheets couldn't account for: magic. By month 6, Derek was a permanent fixture in my life. He'd met my parents, and while my father remained politely distant, his engineer's eyes scanning Derek like a bridge with a suspicious hairline fracture, my mother was charmed. Derek knew how to talk to her. He'd ask about her clinic, listen intently to her stories about Ghana, and always complimented her cooking. He was playing the role of the perfect son-in-law, and he was winning. It was around month 8 when the first tiny shift happened. We were looking at apartments, talking about moving in together. I'd found a beautiful loft in DC, but Derek hesitated. "Simone, honey," he said, taking my hands in his, "it's beautiful. Truly. But I've been thinking about the future. About our future. I want us to have a home, not just a rental. But with my business growing, my liquidity is a bit tied up in some offshore pharmaceutical ventures. It's a temporary thing, but it affects my credit score in the short term." He looked so earnest, so vulnerable. He told me he felt unmanly even bringing it up. He said he wanted to be the provider, but he didn't want to hold me back from the life I deserved. See what he did there? He made his financial instability a testament to his ambition. And me? I did exactly what he expected. I stepped up. "Derek, don't be silly," I told him. "We're a team. If my credit is better, we'll use mine. We'll find a way." The way ended up being me signing for everything. The lease, the utilities, even the new furniture we needed for our shared life. He promised to pay me back once the venture matured, and for a while, he did contribute, small amounts, just enough to keep the illusion alive. Then came the proposal. It was December 2012, 14 months after we met. He took me back to the balcony where we'd spent that first night. The air was freezing, but he had a thermos of hot cocoa and a speech that would have made a stone cry. He talked about how I was his anchor, the one thing in his life that was pure and true. He got down on one knee in the snow, and when I saw that diamond, a ring I later found out was financed on a high-interest credit card I didn't know about, I said yes before he could even finish the question. We were married 2 months later in a small, elegant ceremony. I paid for the lion's share of the wedding, telling myself it was fine because I made more money and I wanted it to be perfect. Derek was the star of the show. He danced with my mother, toasted my father, and looked every bit the successful, loving husband. As we drove away from the reception, I leaned my head on his shoulder and felt a deep sense of peace. I had the career, I had the man, and I had the plan. I didn't realize that the whirlwind hadn't just brought us together, it had successfully blinded me to the fact that I was now the sole financier of a life Derek Fontaine was simply guest starring in. The 14 months were over. The magic had done its job. Now, the real work, his work, was about to begin. And I, the expert project manager, was about to find out what happens when you let a con artist write the project scope. If you were to look at our lives on paper during those first 5 years of marriage, you'd see 2 lines on a graph moving in completely opposite directions. My line was a steady, sharp incline. I was the girl who stayed late, the one who caught the errors in the 200-page contracts, the one clients called when they wanted the truth instead of a sales pitch. By the time I turned 32, I'd been made partner. I remember the day I got the keys to my new office. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I felt like I was finally fulfilling the promise my parents had brought with them from Ghana. Derek's line, however, was a jagged, messy thing, always about to skyrocket, but somehow always snagged on a mystery. That was the era of the success gap. On the surface, Derek looked the part. He wore the $1,000 suits I'd bought him for Christmas, he carried a leather briefcase that I'd treated him to when he landed a big account, and he talked a game that could convince a fish it needed a bicycle. But the math never added up. I remember sitting in our Silver Spring kitchen, the one with the granite countertops and the double ovens I'd picked out myself, reviewing our quarterly goals. "Derek," I said softly, trying not to sound like a project manager, "the commissions from the Pfizer deal haven't hit the joint account yet. Is there a delay with their payroll?" He didn't even look up from his tablet. "Oh, you know how these big pharma mergers are, Simone. Everything is stuck in compliance. It's frustrating for me too, babe. I'm out there breaking my back, and the bean counters are sitting on my money." He'd then walk over, kiss the top of my head, and tell me how proud he was of my partnership. "My brilliant wife," he'd say. "The backbone of this family." And just like that, the conversation was over. He used my success as a cushion for his delays. He made my promotions feel like a victory for us, which made it feel selfish for me to ask where his portion of the mortgage was. In 2019, I decided it was time to move out of our starter home and into something that reflected our status. I found that four-bedroom colonial in Silver Spring. It had a porch where I could imagine us growing old and a backyard large enough for the children I still hoped we might have. When it came time to sign the papers, the complications returned. "The title should be in your name, Simone," Derek said, his voice dripping with phonability. "With my credit still recovering from those old business debts, it'll keep the interest rate lower. Besides, I want you to have the security of knowing this house is yours. I'm just happy to be here with you." I felt a surge of pride. I thought he was being selfless. I thought he was protecting me. I didn't realize he was actually protecting himself. By keeping his name off the title, he didn't have to worry about his creditors coming after the house, and he didn't have to contribute a single cent to the equity. I was building the fortress, and he was just moving into the master suite. The gap wasn't just financial, it was emotional. While I was working 60-hour weeks to maintain the lifestyle he demanded, he was traveling. The pharmaceutical sales world, according to Derek, required constant face time. He'd be in Chicago for 3 days, then Atlanta for a week, then a mandatory retreat in Miami. I'd be home alone, eating dinner over my laptop, while he sent me photos of steak dinners and hotel views. "Missing my partner in crime," the captions would say. I'd feel a twinge of loneliness, but then I'd look at the beautiful house, the partnership plaque on my wall, and the handsome man in the photos, and I'd tell myself that this was what success looked like. I was so busy closing the gap with my own effort that I didn't see what was filling the empty space. I was working for a future that didn't exist, while he was living a present that I was paying for. The bridge was creaking, the load-bearing walls were bowing under the weight of his lies, but I was still painting the front door and planting marigolds in the garden. I was a project manager who had fallen in love with a bad design, and I was determined to make it work, no matter the cost. It was the spring of 2020 when the car entered the picture. Now, in our culture, a car isn't just a way to get from point A to point B, it's a statement. My father always drove a sensible, silver sedan that he washed every Saturday morning like it was a holy ritual. He used to say, "Simone, you buy a car for the engine, not the badge. The engine gets you to work, the badge just gets you attention you don't need." But Derek lived for the badge. By then, his consulting work was supposedly taking off, though the bank statements still looked like a desert after a long drought. He came to me one evening with a brochure for a 2019 Mercedes E-Class. It was sleek, charcoal gray, with an interior that smelled like a billionaire's library. "Simone, think about the optics," he said, pacing the length of our kitchen. "When I pull up to these high-level pharma meetings in that old SUV, I'm telling them I'm mid-level. But if I pull up in this?" I'm telling them I'm the closer. It's an investment in the Fontaine brand. I looked at the price tag and winced. Derek, we just finished the renovations on the guest bath. Is this the best time? He did that thing he always did. He dropped his voice and looked at me with those soft, wounded eyes. I'm not asking you to buy it for me, baby. I'm asking you to help me secure our future. And here's the thing, if we put it in your name, the insurance through your firm's executive plan is half what I'd pay. Plus, your credit score is, well, it's legendary. We'd get the 0% financing. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. It'll be your car, legally. I'll just be the one putting the miles on it for work. Think of it as a business asset. I fell for it. I actually felt a sense of power when I signed those papers at the dealership. I was the one with the legendary credit. I was the one the salesman shook hands with. Derek was just the passenger. Or so I thought. For the next 3 years, that car became Derek's sanctuary. He spent more time in that Mercedes than he did in our living room. He'd spend hours detailing it in the driveway, or sitting in the driver's seat taking confidential calls. I didn't realize that the car wasn't a business asset, it was a getaway vehicle. By putting the title in my name, he'd achieved 2 things. First, he made sure that if any of his investments went south, the repo man couldn't touch his precious ride. Second, he'd tied me to his movements in a way I hadn't yet realized. Every time I saw that car in the driveway, I saw my own success reflected in the chrome. I didn't see the truth, that I was paying the note, the insurance, and the maintenance for a man who was using my hard-earned money to drive away from me. I remember one night, it must have been a Tuesday, I saw him through the window. He was sitting in the car in the dark, the dashboard lights glowing blue against his face. He looked different. There was a coldness in his expression that he never showed me. He was staring at his phone, a slight smile on his lips that had nothing to do with me or our marriage. I almost went out there. I almost tapped on the glass and asked him who he was talking to. But then I thought about what he'd say. He'd have an explanation. He'd say it was a client in a different time zone. He'd say I was being paranoid. He'd call me his anchor and kiss my forehead, and I'd feel guilty for even asking. So I stayed inside. I let him keep his secrets in the car I bought him. I didn't know that 3 years later, that very same Mercedes, the one I'd signed for with such pride, would be the very thing that finally delivered him to a jail cell. I didn't know that the GPS I'd insisted on for my own safety would be the silent witness to every mile he traveled toward another woman's heart. The Mercedes wasn't an investment in the Fontaine brand. It was the first piece of evidence in the case I didn't even know I was building. You know, there's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from living with a liar. It's not the kind of tired you feel after a long day at the office or a hard workout. It's a soul-deep weariness that comes from constantly doubting your own eyes. For 12 years, Derek didn't just tell lies, he managed my reality. In the consulting world, we call it shaping the narrative, but in a marriage, it's just plain cruelty. I remember one Saturday afternoon, about 7 years in. I was doing the laundry, because despite being a partner at a firm, I still found peace in the domestic rhythms my mother taught me. I reached into the pocket of one of Derek's expensive suit jackets and pulled out a receipt for a jewelry store in D.C. It was for a diamond tennis bracelet, purchased 3 days prior. My heart leaped. Our anniversary was coming up, and I thought, finally, he's seeing me. He's acknowledging everything I do. I put the receipt back, said nothing, and waited. Our anniversary came and went. He took me to a nice dinner, which I paid for because he forgot his wallet in his other suit, but there was no bracelet. A week later, I couldn't hold it in anymore. Derek, I asked as we were getting ready for bed, I saw a receipt in your pocket last week. For a jewelry store? I thought maybe it was a surprise, but now I'm just confused. He didn't skip a beat. He didn't even stop buttoning his pajama shirt. He just looked at me with this profound, heavy sadness. Simone. Really? You're going through my pockets now? I wasn't going through them, I was doing the laundry. It was a gift for a client, Simone, he interrupted, his voice dropping to that disappointed register that always made me feel like a small, naughty child. A high-net-worth VP who just closed a massive deal. I told you I was working on that account. I can't believe you jumped to such a dark place. Is that really what you think of me after all these years? That I'm some kind of cliché? He spent the next 3 hours making me apologize to him. By the end of the night, I was the one crying, promising to trust him more, promising to stop being so suspicious. That was his masterpiece, turning my common sense into a character flaw. This happened hundreds of times. I'd noticed the smell of a perfume that wasn't mine on his collar, and he'd explain it was the aggressive scent marketing in the luxury hotel lobby where he had his meetings. I'd see a text message pop up from a mic at 11 p.m., and he'd explain it was a desperate colleague on the verge of a breakdown. He had an answer for everything, and if the answer didn't quite make sense, he'd just make me feel like I was too narrow-minded to understand the complexities of his world. It's like being in a room where the walls are moving inward by an inch every day. It happens so slowly that you don't notice the space shrinking until you can't breathe. I became a version of myself I didn't recognize, a woman who second-guessed her own memory. I started keeping a private journal, not for my feelings, but for facts. January 12th, Derek said he was in Chicago. The weather app says it's snowing there, but when he called, I heard a lawnmower in the background. I'd look at that note and then look at him at the dinner table, and I'd feel like I was losing my mind. Why would he lie about the weather? Why would he lie about a lawnmower? It seemed too small, too insignificant. But that's the trick. If they can make you doubt the small things, you'll never trust yourself enough to challenge the big ones. My father used to say that you can't fix a structure if the blueprint is a lie. For a decade, I was trying to renovate a marriage using a fraudulent blueprint. I was the one doing the heavy lifting, the one securing the permits, the one paying the contractors, while Derek was out back, quietly dismantling the foundation one brick at a time. I was exhausted, but I was also successful. I had the house, the title, the Mercedes in the driveway, and the handsome husband on my arm at company galas. To the outside world, the Fontaine Bridge was a marvel of modern engineering. But inside, in the quiet moments when the lights were out and Derek was working late in the other room, I could hear the wood splintering. I just wasn't ready to admit that the whole thing was about to come crashing down. It started like any other Tuesday. The sun was just beginning to peek through the blinds of our bedroom, casting long, thin shadows across the ivory duvet, the one I'd bought because Derek said it made our room feel like a boutique hotel. I was already up, sitting at the vanity, applying my pearls and preparing for a day of budget reviews and client disputes. Derek was still in bed, propped up on his pillows, watching the morning news with a look of intense concentration. He looked like the picture of a successful man, but there was a tension in his jaw that I'd learned to recognize over the years. It was the look he wore when he was about to launch a new story. "Simone," he said, his voice casual, almost bored. "I've got a bit of a situation. I took the SUV into the shop this morning before you woke up. The mechanic says the transmission is shot. They need to keep it for at least a week to source the parts." I paused, my earring halfway to my ear. "A week? Derek, that car is only 4 years old. How is the transmission already gone?" He let out a long, weary sigh, the sigh of a man burdened by the incompetence of the world. "I know, right? It's a lemon. I'm going to have words with the dealership, believe me. But in the meantime, I've got that big regional summit in Bethesda starting today. I can't be rolling up in a rental. It'll tank my leverage. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He walked over to me, standing behind me so our eyes met in the vanity mirror. He placed his hands on my shoulders, heavy, warm, and familiar. I'm going to need to borrow the Mercedes, babe. Just for the week. I'll be back and forth to the hotel, but I'll take care of it. I'll even get it detailed before I bring it back to you. I felt that old, familiar twist in my gut. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was more like a low-voltage hum of static. My brain was already running the numbers. A week. I had 4 off-site meetings. I'd have to Uber or take the metro, which meant adding an hour to my already packed commute. Derek, I have a really busy week. Could you just get a luxury rental? My firm will even cover a portion of it if we label it a secondary business expense. The warmth in his hands vanished instantly. He didn't pull away, but the energy changed. A rental? Simone, I'm trying to close a 7-figure deal that will finally get us into that beach property you've been looking at. And you want me to waste time at a Hertz counter? After everything I do to support your career, you can't let me use the car that's sitting in our driveway? There it was. The pivot. In 3 sentences, he'd turned a simple logistical question into a test of my loyalty and a slight against my ambition. He was the supporter, and I was the obstacle. I didn't say that, Derek. I just meant. Forget it, he said, walking toward the closet. I'll just take the metro. I'll show up to a multi-million-dollar negotiation sweating and wrinkled. It's fine. Your schedule is clearly the priority here. I looked at him, the slumped shoulders, the calculated disappointment. For 12 years, this maneuver had worked on me every single time. I was a project manager. My instinct was to resolve conflict and keep the timeline moving. I hated being the reason things stalled. Fine, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out the spare key. Take the Mercedes. But I need it back by Sunday evening. I have a presentation in Baltimore on Monday morning, and I need my own wheels. He turned around, the disappointment vanishing like a ghost. He flashed that brilliant, devastating smile, the one from the gala, and crossed the room in 3 strides. He took the keys from my hand and kissed my cheek. You're the best, Simone. Seriously. I don't know what I'd do without my anchor. I watched him from the bedroom window a few minutes later. He didn't look like a man worried about a transmission. He looked like a man who had just won a prize. He climbed into the charcoal gray Mercedes, adjusted the mirror, and pulled out of the driveway with a flourish. As the tail lights disappeared around the corner, that static hum in my gut didn't go away. It got louder. I thought about the SUV. He said he took it in before I woke up, but I'm a light sleeper. I hadn't heard the garage door open until he left in my car. I hadn't seen a tow truck. I sat back down at my vanity, but I didn't finish my makeup. I looked at the spot where the spare key had been. My father's voice echoed in my head, the person who is going to bite you is usually the one wearing your own clothes. Derek wasn't wearing my clothes, but he was driving my car. He was using the tools I had provided to build a life I wasn't invited to. For the first time in a decade, I didn't try to explain away the feeling. I didn't tell myself I was being too sensitive. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the app one hadn't opened in years. He thought he had just closed another deal with his anchor. He didn't realize that this time, the anchor was attached to a chain, and I was about to start reeling it in. I stood there by the window for a long time after the Mercedes disappeared, the silence of the house feeling heavier than usual. It's funny how a house can suddenly feel too big when you start to suspect the person who shares it with you isn't really there at all. I went to the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee, but my hands were shaking so hard the spoon clattered against the porcelain. I sat down at the breakfast nook, the one Derek called our strategy center, and pulled my phone out of my blazer pocket. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt like a criminal, which is the great irony of being gaslit for a decade. You feel guilty for simply seeking the truth. I scrolled through my apps until I found it, the Mercedes Me Connect icon. When we bought the car, the salesman had gone on and on about the peace of mind features. Remote start, door locking, and most importantly, the vehicle tracker. Derek had laughed it off at the time, calling it nanny software, but I'd set it up anyway. I'm an engineer's daughter. I like to know how things work. I tapped the icon. The screen stayed white for a heartbeat too long, the little loading circle spinning and spinning. I found myself whispering, "Please let me be wrong. Please let the car be at a hotel in Bethesda." I wanted to be the crazy, paranoid wife he always accused me of being. I wanted to be wrong because being right meant the last 12 years were a ghost story. The map snapped into focus. There was the blue dot. It wasn't in Silver Spring, and it certainly wasn't headed toward the I-495 corridor toward Bethesda. It was moving south, weaving through the morning traffic of the city. I watched it pulse. I watched it stop at a red light. I watched it turn onto a side street. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. The dot finally settled. It stopped pulsing and turned into a solid pin. I pinched the screen to zoom in, my breath hitching in my throat. The address popped up in a little white bubble, 2847, Willow Creek Drive, Bethesda. Now, on the surface, that sounded like what he told me. Bethesda. But I knew that neighborhood. That wasn't where the hotels were. That wasn't where the regional summit would be held. That was a residential pocket, a place of leafy trees and quiet luxury apartments. I opened my laptop and pulled up a satellite view of the address. It was a complex called the Willows. Lush landscaping, a resort-style pool, and private balconies. I looked at the floor plans listed on their website. 1 and 2 bedroom units starting at $2,800 a month. I looked back at my phone. The car was parked in the back lot of that complex, right near Building 7. A coldness washed over me, starting at the base of my neck and spreading down to my toes. It was the kind of cold you only feel when the last piece of a puzzle clicks into place and the picture it forms is a nightmare. The transmission wasn't broken. There was no regional summit. There was only a destination that required my car and a week of my absence. I remembered my father's ledger. I remembered how he taught me to never accept a total without seeing the line items. Derek had given me the total, a broken car and a work trip, but the line items were all wrong. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I just sat there and watched that little blue pin. Part of me expected it to move, expected him to realize he'd forgotten something and drive to an actual office. But the pin stayed still. It stayed still while I finished my coffee. It stayed still while I drove myself to the metro station in an Uber. It stayed still while I sat through a 4-hour board meeting, pretending to care about quarterly projections while my soul was vibrating with a new, terrifying clarity. Every few hours, I'd pull my phone under the conference table and check. Still there. Building 7. Apartment complex. Bethesda. I realized then that the app hadn't just changed my day, it had ended my marriage. For years, Derek had used his words to paint over reality. But he couldn't paint over a GPS signal. He couldn't explain his way out of a satellite ping. For the first time in our marriage, I had a fact that didn't depend on his permission to be true. I felt a strange, flickering sense of power. It was small, like a candle in a dark tunnel, but it was there. I was a project manager, and I had just discovered a massive, undocumented deviation in the project scope. I didn't cry. My mother's daughter doesn't cry until the work is done. Instead, I opened a new file on my phone's notes app. I titled it, Project 2847. Entry 1, Tuesday, 8:45 a.m. Vehicle located at Willow Creek Drive. Subject claimed to be at Summit. Summit does not exist at this location. The anchor had finally hit the bottom, and I was starting to realize just how deep the water really was. You know, the world looks different when you're watching it through the lens of a ghost. That's what I felt like those first 48 hours, a ghost haunting my own life. I went through the motions at the office, I led the stand-up meetings, I signed off on the payroll, but my mind was perpetually 30 miles away in a parking lot in Bethesda. Day 1 was the hardest. It was the day of the great internal battle. One half of me, the half that still carried the Simone who wore a borrowed dress to a gala, was screaming that there had to be an explanation. Maybe he had a friend there? Maybe he was staying with a colleague to be closer to the summit? But the other half, the project manager, the daughter of the mechanical engineer, was looking at the data. And the data was cold, hard, and unforgiving. At 5:45 p.m. on Tuesday, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Derek, meetings ran late. Absolute Shark Tank here, babe. Taking the team out for a quick dinner then heading back to the hotel. So tired already. Miss you. I looked at my tracking app. The Mercedes hadn't moved an inch since 8:45 a.m. He wasn't at a dinner. He wasn't with a team. He was in Building 7. I stared at his message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to type, "Which hotel, Derek?" Because the car is at the Willows. But I didn't. I remembered what my mother said about the hunter who makes noise before the trap is set. She'd say, "Simone, if you flush the bird too early, all you get is feathers. If you wait, you get the bird." So I typed back, "Sounds exhausting. Get some rest. See you Sunday." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in our bed, the ivory duvet feeling like a shroud, watching the blue dot. At 7:23 a.m. on Wednesday, day 2, the dot finally began to move. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe he's going to an office. Maybe the summit is real. I watched the dot travel through Bethesda, merge onto the highway, and pull into the parking structure of his actual office building downtown. He stayed there all day. I actually felt a moment of relief. See? I told myself. He's at work. He just stayed at a friend's place last night. But then came 5:47 p.m. Most people leave work and head home. Most people in a complicated situation might even go to a bar or a gym. But Derek? Derek drove straight back to 2847, Willow Creek Drive. He stopped at a grocery store for 15 minutes on the way. I watched the pin sit in the Safeway parking lot, and then he went home. He wasn't staying with a friend. He wasn't at a hotel. He was playing house. The realization hit me like a physical blow. When you've been gaslit for as long as I had, you start to believe that the truth is something fluid, something that can be negotiated. But watching that return to the same residential address after a stop at a grocery store, that wasn't a mistake. That was a routine. That night, Derek called. His voice was bright, full of that manufactured charisma that used to make my heart melt. "Hey, Anchor. Just checking in. The summit is going great. I think we're going to hit the numbers. How's the house? Quiet without me?" "It's very quiet, Derek," I said, my voice as flat as a sheet of glass. "I bet. Listen, I've gotta run. Some of the guys are meeting in the lounge to go over the morning presentation. I'll call you tomorrow?" "Sure, Derek. Go over your presentation." I hung up and looked at the map. He wasn't in a lounge. He was in apartment 7B. I knew it was 7B because I'd spent my lunch break cross-referencing the parking space number with the building directory I'd found online. I realized then that for 2 days, I'd been hoping for a lie I could live with. I had been looking for a way to save the bridge. But as I watched the blue dot settle in for its second night at the Willows, I understood that the bridge wasn't just cracked. It had been dismantled years ago, and Derek had been using the timber to build a new life just a few miles away. I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like a technician. I opened my notebook and added the timestamps for day 2. I took screenshots of his lounge call versus the GPS location. I was no longer a wife waiting for an explanation. I was a woman collecting the components of an explosion. My father always said that if you want to take down a faulty structure, you don't just kick it. You find the points of greatest tension, and you remove the pins. Derek thought he was the one in control because he had the car and the stories. He didn't realize that I was the one with the map, and I was just getting started. By the morning of day 3, the shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. You know, in project management, there's a phase we call root cause analysis. It's not enough to know a project is failing. You have to find out exactly where the rot started so you can make sure it never happens again. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I was restless, but because I had work to do. I sat at my kitchen island with a legal pad and my laptop. The blue dot was still at 2847 Willow Creek Drive. It hadn't budged. I decided it was time to put a name to the location. I called the main office of the Willows at Bethesda. I put on my professional Simone voice, the one that gets contractors to move mountains. Hi, good morning. This is Simone Fontaine. I'm trying to coordinate a surprise floral delivery for a resident in Building 7, Apartment 7B, but I want to make sure I have the correct spelling of the name for the card. Could you confirm the primary resident for that unit? The woman on the other end was young and helpful. Oh, how sweet. Let me check. Apartment 7B, that unit is leased to a Miss Tanya Richardson. Would you like me to transfer you to her unit or just leave the note? No, that's okay, I said, my heart feeling like a cold stone in my chest. Tanya Richardson. Perfect. I'll call back when the florist is ready. Thank you. Tanya Richardson. I opened my laptop and went to work. I'm not a private investigator, but I have a degree in making sense of data. I started with LinkedIn. Within seconds, there she was. Tanya Richardson, marketing coordinator at a major pharmaceutical firm. My stomach dropped. It was the same company Derek consulted for. They didn't just meet at a bar, they worked together. Then I moved to Instagram. Her profile wasn't private, a mistake Derek would never have made, but Tanya clearly liked to be seen. I scrolled through years of photos. Brunches, workout selfies, pictures of her cat. And then, I saw him. Well, I didn't see him, not his face. Tanya was clever in her own way. There were photos of her at dinner where a man's hand was visible, resting on the table. I recognized the watch. It was the Breitling I'd bought him for his 35th birthday. There was another photo of her on a balcony, the same balcony at Willow Creek, with a man's shoulder in the frame. He was wearing the blue linen shirt I'd ironed for him 2 weeks ago. I scrolled further back. A year. 2 years. 3 years. 3 years ago, there was a photo of her at a resort in Cancun. The caption said, "Best anniversary trip ever with my favorite guy. Thank you for making me feel like a queen." I looked at the date. That was the same weekend Derek told me he was at a global logistics symposium in Toronto. I remembered crying that weekend because the house felt so empty. He had been in Cancun, sipping margaritas with Tanya, wearing the sunglasses I'd tucked into his suitcase. 3 years. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a second life. Day 4 was a blur of screenshots and timestamps. I was no longer just tracking a car, I was documenting a heist. Derek was stealing my time, my money, and my emotional labor to fund a 3-year fairy tale for a woman who probably thought he was a divorced bachelor. He called me that evening, sounding tired, no doubt from the stress of his fake summit. "Hey, babe. Almost done here. One more big push tomorrow and I'll be home Sunday. I can't wait to sleep in my own bed." "I bet you can't, Derek," I said. I was looking at a photo Tanya had posted just an hour ago. It was a picture of 2 wine glasses and a cheese board on her coffee table. The caption read, "Date night in with my love. So glad he's finally back from his business trip." She even put business trip in quotes. Did she know? Or was it an inside joke between them about how he had to deal with me? I realized then that Derek's greatest skill wasn't sales, it was compartmentalization. He could look me in the eye and call me his anchor while texting Tanya that he was counting down the minutes until he could be with her. He wasn't just a liar, he was a thief of reality. I added the screenshots to Project 2847. I had the GPS logs. I had the name of the mistress. I had the timeline of the 3-year betrayal. But most importantly, I had my car title. My father always said that if you want to win a fight, you don't use your fists, you use the rules. Derek had spent 12 years breaking the rules of our marriage, but he'd forgotten that the rules of the state were still in my favor. I didn't need to scream at Tanya, and I didn't need to beg Derek for the truth. I just needed to wait for day 6. The project was almost complete. The points of tension had been identified. All that was left was to pull the pin. There is a hollow, ringing sound that fills your ears when you realize your life hasn't just been a mistake, but a performance. As I sat in my home office on the evening of day 4, the blue light of my laptop reflecting off my glasses, I wasn't just looking at social media posts. I was looking at the debris of a decade. 3 years. That's 1,095 days. I started doing the math, the project manager in me just couldn't help it. 1,000 days of him coming home to me, kissing my forehead, and asking what was for dinner, all while he had a whole other closet, a whole other routine, and a whole other love just 20 minutes down the road. I found a photo Tanya had posted from 2 years ago. It was a picture of a small, wrapped box from a high-end jeweler. The caption was, "He knows exactly how to make a girl feel special." #surprise #diamond life. I checked the date. It was 2 days after I'd found that receipt in Derek's pocket, the one he'd made me apologize for finding. The one he said was for a high-net-worth client. He hadn't just lied to me, he had used my emotional submission as a tool to cover his tracks for her. Every time I trusted him, I was actually subsidizing his betrayal. I sat there, staring at the screen until my eyes burned. I saw photos of them at the botanical gardens on a day he said he was at a funeral. I saw them at a jazz club on a night he said he was working late to secure my partnership. It was all there, laid out in a digital gallery of my own humiliation. But then, I saw something that changed my perspective. I found a post from Tanya 6 months back. It was a Woman Crush Wednesday post where she wrote a long, glowing paragraph about her supportive, hardworking partner who was finally finalizing a difficult divorce from a toxic ex. I actually gasped. I was the toxic ex. In her world, I was already gone. I was a ghost he was just cleaning up before their real life could begin. He hadn't told her he was married, he'd told her he was a victim. He was playing both of us, weaving 2 different tapestries of lies so that no matter which way he turned, he had a soft place to land. A strange kind of calm settled over me then. You know, when a building is being demolished, there's a moment right after the charges go off but before the walls fall, where everything is perfectly still. That was me. The anger was there, buried deep, but on the surface, I was pure ice. I realized that if I confronted him now, he'd just launch Explanations 2.0. He'd say the photos were old, or that Tanya was a stalker, or that he was undercover for a business deal. He would find a way to make me feel like the toxic one again. And if I divorced him the traditional way? He'd walk away with half of the house I paid for, half of the retirement I earned, and probably that Mercedes, too. No. My mother didn't raise me to be a casualty. She raised me to be a survivor. And survivors don't just leave, they protect what's theirs. I looked at my car title on the desk. Simone Fontaine. Just one name. I looked at the GPS app 2847, Willow Creek Drive. Just one location. Derek had spent 3 years building a life with Tanya using my resources. He thought he was the architect of this grand design. He didn't realize that I had just found the structural flaw that would bring the whole thing down on his head. He wanted a divorce from a toxic ex? Well, I was about to give him a legal experience he'd never forget. But first, I needed to make a phone call to a woman who made my father's engineering look like child's play. It was time to call Michelle Torres. By the morning of day 5, I had moved past the why, and settled firmly into the how. In my line of work, when a project goes into recovery mode, you stop looking at the person who caused the delay and you start looking at the deliverables. My deliverable was my freedom, and more importantly, my dignity. I spent the morning creating what I called the Fontaine Master File. I pulled up every credit card statement from the last 3 years, the ones Derek thought I never looked at because he always offered to handle the filing. I sat there with a highlighter, a red pen, and a heart that felt like it had been tempered in a furnace. I began to see the patterns. The client dinners at a little Italian place in Bethesda that always happened on Thursdays. The ATM withdrawals for petty cash that matched the dates of Tanya's Instagram posts about weekend trips. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was embezzling from our life. Every mortgage payment I made solo while he caught up on commissions was essentially a donation to his life with another woman. I opened a spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, Derek's lie. Column C, the GPS truth. Column D, the financial cost. August 14th, said he was in Philadelphia for a pharma conference. GPS shows the Mercedes at the Delaware shore. Bank statement shows a $300 charge at a boutique hotel. Outcome: I paid the full mortgage that month because he said he was short on cash due to travel expenses. Line by line, I reconstructed the last 3 years. It was a ledger of betrayal. I printed it out, 54 pages of documentation. I held that stack of paper in my hands and felt the weight of it. It was heavy, like a brick. And that's exactly what it was, the first stone in the wall I was building between my future and his past. I went to the garage and looked at the empty spot where the Mercedes should have been. I looked at the SUV, the one with the broken transmission. I walked over to it, pulled my spare set of keys from my pocket, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life. No sputtering. No warning lights. The transmission shifted into reverse smoother than silk. He hadn't even bothered to make the lie believable. He just assumed I wouldn't check. He assumed that 12 years of yes, Derek and I trust you, Derek had made me soft. He thought he'd trained me to ignore the evidence of my own senses. I took a video of the dashboard, the date, and the smooth shifting of the gears. Entry 42, Friday, 10:15 a.m. Verified SUV transmission is fully functional. Subject's claim of mechanical failure is confirmed as a pretext to secure the Mercedes for unauthorized travel. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for my career. Most women in my position would be in bed with the curtains drawn, and believe me, I wanted to be. But the project manager in me wouldn't let me. There were deadlines to meet. There were stakeholders, meaning me, to protect. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the house. Not because I wanted it nice for him, but because I wanted to erase him. I packed a small box of his things, just the essentials, and put it in the garage. I felt like I was prepping a site for a controlled demolition. You clear out the valuables, you set the charges, and you make sure everyone is at a safe distance before you press the button. I checked the app one last time before bed. He was still there. Apartment 7B. Probably sitting on the sofa I'd picked out for our first apartment, laughing with a woman who thought I was a toxic ex. Enjoy the wine, Derek, I whispered to the empty room. Enjoy the silk sheets and the sandalwood cologne. Because tomorrow, the project is moving into the final phase. And the one thing you didn't account for in your explanations is that I keep a very detailed log. I went to sleep that night and for the first time in 5 days, I didn't watch the dot. I knew exactly where he was. And more importantly, I knew exactly where he was going. If there is one thing I've learned in the corporate world, it's that when you're going to war, you don't hire a diplomat. You hire a strategist. That's why, on the morning of day 5, I sat in the glass-walled office of Michelle Torres. Michelle was a woman who didn't walk so much as she vibrated with a sharp, legal energy. She had a reputation for being the Doberman of divorce in Maryland, and looking at the way she adjusted her reading glasses, I knew I was in the right place. I laid the Fontaine master file on her desk. She didn't look at me at first. She just started flipping through the pages, the GPS logs, the bank statements, the screenshots of Tanya's Instagram. The only sound in the room was the crisp rustle of paper and the ticking of a very expensive clock on her wall. "Mrs. Fontaine," she said finally, looking up with a thin, predatory smile. "You're a project manager, aren't you?" "I am," I replied. "It shows. Most people bring me a box of tissues and a series of rambling grievances. You've brought me a roadmap to a settlement." She leaned back, tapping a gold pen against her chin. "Now, tell me exactly what you're hoping to accomplish. Do you want him back, or do you want him gone?" "I want him gone," I said, my voice steady. "But I want to protect my assets. The house is in my name. The car is in my name. I've spent 12 years funding his lifestyle, and I refuse to let him take a single brick of what I've built as a parting gift." Michelle nodded slowly. "Maryland is an equitable distribution state. Usually, that means things get split down the middle. But property titled solely in your name before the marriage, or purchased with your separate funds, like your salary, during the marriage, can often be protected, especially if we can prove dissipation of marital assets." She pointed to the spreadsheet where I'd highlighted the 3 years of secret dinners and trips. This is him spending your money on another woman. That's not just cheating, that's financial theft. A judge will not look kindly on a man who asks his wife to pay the mortgage while he's buying diamonds for a mistress. Then, I told her about the car. I told her how he'd manipulated me into giving him the keys to the Mercedes by lying about his own vehicle being broken. Michelle's eyes sharpened. "Wait. You said the Mercedes is titled solely in your name? And you have proof that his car is perfectly fine?" "I have a video from this morning of his car running perfectly," I said. Michelle leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mrs. Fontaine, are you aware that in this state, taking someone's vehicle under false pretenses and refusing to return it can constitute unauthorized use of a motor vehicle? Even between spouses, if the title is solely in one name, the other spouse has no inherent right to it without permission. And you gave permission based on a lie." I felt a shiver of realization. "So, if I ask for it back and he refuses?" "Then he's not just a cheating husband," Michelle finished. "He's a car thief." And if he's in Bethesda, that falls under Montgomery County jurisdiction. They take grand theft auto very seriously. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. You have two choices, Simone. You can call him, scream, and tell him to come home, in which case he'll bring the car back and we'll start a long, boring divorce. Or, you can withdraw your permission for him to use that vehicle. Right now. Via text. So there's a record. I looked at my phone. I thought about the 3 years of toxic ex comments. I thought about the Cancun trip. I thought about the sandalwood cologne. What happens if I withdraw permission and he doesn't bring it back? I asked. Michelle turned around, a wicked glint in her eyes. Then you walk into the police station, you show them that title, you show them that GPS location, and you tell them your car has been stolen. After that, the law takes over. And believe me, Derek Fontaine won't be able to explain his way out of a set of handcuffs. I stood up, my mind made up. I wasn't just a project manager anymore. I was the chief operating officer of my own justice. Write the text for me, Michelle. Let's make sure the documentation is perfect. As I left her office, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For 12 years, I had played by Derek's rules. I had accepted his explanations because I wanted to be a good wife. But Michelle Torres had reminded me of who I really was. I was Simone Achabi. I was the daughter of an engineer. And I was about to show Derek Fontaine exactly what happens when you try to steal from a woman who knows how to keep a log. By the morning of day 6, the sun wasn't even up, but I was already sitting in the parking lot of the Montgomery County Police Department. The air in the car was cold, and the streetlights outside were reflecting off the damp pavement. I held a manila folder in my lap, the culmination of 12 years of trust and 6 days of discovery. I checked my phone one last time. I had sent the text at 8 p.m. the night before, just as Michelle instructed. It was short, professional, and final. Derek, I know the SUV is not in the shop. I have verified it is working. You do not have my permission to drive the Mercedes. Return it to the house by 10 p.m. tonight, or I will be forced to report it as unauthorized use. His response at 10:15 p.m. had been vintage Derek. Simone, you're being hysterical. I told you, I'm at a summit. I'll bring the car back when the work is done. Stop acting like a child. I'm turning my phone off to get some sleep. We'll talk Sunday. He had effectively signed his own arrest warrant. He didn't realize that in the eyes of the law, hysterical isn't a legal defense for retaining property after permission has been revoked. I walked into the station. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The woman behind the desk was Sergeant Patricia Holloway. She had silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun and eyes that looked like they had seen every excuse in the book. "How can I help you this morning, ma'am?" she asked, her voice raspy but kind. "I'm here to report a stolen vehicle," I said. I placed the folder on the counter. "My husband took my car 6 days ago under false pretenses. I have revoked his permission to use it, and he has refused to return it. He is currently at a residential location in Bethesda." Sergeant Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Your husband?" "Usually, these things are handled in civil court, ma'am." "Is the car marital property?" I opened the folder. "The vehicle is titled solely in my name. I purchased it with my separate funds. Here is the title. Here is the video evidence that the mechanical failure he used to get the keys was a lie. And here," I said, sliding the printed text exchange across the counter, "is my formal revocation of permission and his refusal to comply." The sergeant put on her reading glasses. She went through the folder slowly. She looked at the GPS logs. She looked at the screenshots of the Mercedes sitting at the Willow Creek Apartments for 5 consecutive nights. She looked at me, then back at the papers. You're a project manager, aren't you? She asked. I blinked. Is it that obvious? She chuckled, a dry, rhythmic sound. Ma'am, in 30 years on the force, I've had hundreds of women come in here crying about a cheating husband taking the car. Most of them don't even know their own license plate number. You've given me a complete evidentiary package. You've done my job for me. She stood up and walked to a computer terminal. Let me make sure I have this straight. You told him to bring it back by 10, he refused, and you can prove he's not at a work event? Correct. I have the itinerary for the summit he claimed to be attending. It's held in D.C., not Bethesda, and his name isn't on the registration list. Sergeant Holloway shook her head. Some men really think they're the only ones in the room with a brain. All right, Mrs. Fontaine. I'm going to file this report as unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. Since the value of a 2019 Mercedes exceeds $30,000, the prosecutor may look at felony theft charges once we recover it. And when will you recover it? I asked. We have a unit in that precinct. I'll issue a bolo, be on the lookout. If the car is sitting in a public lot at that apartment complex, we'll go get it. And if he's with it, or if he tries to stop us, well, that's on him. I signed the paperwork. My hand was steady. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like I was finally closing a project that had been over budget and behind schedule for a decade. As I walked out into the crisp morning air, I felt a strange sense of peace. Derek thought he was the master of explanations. He thought he could just tell a story and I would have to live inside it. But stories don't stand up in a precinct office. Only documentation does. I went home, made myself a pot of tea, and waited. I knew the blue dot was still at Willow Creek. I knew Tanya was probably making him breakfast. And I knew that in a few hours, the satisfying silence I'd been waiting for was finally going to arrive. The call came at 11:47 p.m. I had spent the evening in my living room with the lights off, watching the rain streak against the windows. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just waiting for the final report to come in. When my phone vibrated on the coffee table, the caller ID read, Montgomery County Police. Mrs. Fontaine? This is Sergeant Holloway. Yes, Sergeant. Did you find the vehicle? We did. 2847, Willow Creek Drive, just like you said. We found it parked in a reserved space for apartment 7B. There was a pause, the kind of professional silence that precedes a storm. Your husband was present when we arrived. He was not cooperative. I leaned back into the sofa, closing my eyes. What happened? Well, ma'am, when the officers approached the vehicle to verify the VIN, your husband came out of the building. He was in his pajamas. He started shouting, claiming the car was his and that the police had no right to touch it. When my officers explained that the car had been reported stolen by the registered owner, he started spinning a story about a domestic misunderstanding. He told them you were mentally unstable and that he was just trying to protect the car from you. I felt a cold prickle of recognition. There it was, the final explanation. Even at midnight, in front of armed officers, he was still trying to gaslight the world into believing I was the problem. And did they believe him? I asked. No, ma'am, Holloway said, and I could hear the faint edge of a smile in her voice. Because we had your folder. We showed him the title. We showed him the text message you sent at 8 o'clock revoking his permission. And then, we showed him the GPS logs. When he realized we knew exactly how long that car had been sitting in that lot, he stopped shouting. He tried to go back inside, but since the vehicle is valued as grand theft, and he was resisting a lawful recovery, the officers took him into custody. He was arrested? Handcuffed and transported. He's being booked as we speak for unauthorized use of a motor vehicle and obstructing an officer. And Mrs. Fontaine? There was a woman with him. A Tanya Richardson. She was quite upset. She kept asking the officers why Derek's ex-wife was reporting his car stolen. One of the officers had to inform her that you were, in fact, still very much his current wife. The satisfaction that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the heat of revenge, it was the coolness of justice. For 12 years, Derek had lived in the spaces between the truth. He had built a life on the assumption that nobody would ever cross-reference his stories. But tonight, the data had caught up to him. Your vehicle has been towed to the impound lot on Cedar Lane, Holloway continued. You can pick it up tomorrow morning. We'll need a formal statement to finalize the charges. I'll be there at 8, Sergeant. Thank you. I hung up the phone and looked out at the dark street. Somewhere across town, Derek Fontaine was sitting in a holding cell. He was probably trying to explain his way out of it to a bored guard. He was probably rehearsing the story he'd tell me to get back into the house. But he forgot that the satisfying silence I wanted wasn't just him stopping his lies, it was the world finally refusing to listen to them. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands were perfectly steady. The project was entering the closeout phase. The debris was being cleared. And for the first time in a decade, I was the one holding the keys to my own life. Derek was released on bail the following afternoon. I wasn't there to pick him up, and I certainly wasn't there to hear his side of the story. While he was sitting in that cell, I had been busy. I'd called a locksmith, a man who didn't ask questions and worked fast, and had every exterior lock on the Silver Spring house changed. I'd also spent 4 hours packing. I didn't throw his things out on the lawn. I'm a daughter of Ghana, and we carry ourselves with more dignity than that. But I did pack his life into 24 neatly taped cardboard boxes and stacked them in the garage. I was sitting in my kitchen, sipping a cup of tea, when the notification on my phone chimed. My Ring doorbell showed a car pulling up, a cheap rental, likely paid for by a frantic Tanya. Derek stepped out. He looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and that devastating charm had been replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He marched up to the front porch and reached for his keys. I watched through the camera as he tried to jam his key into the new lock. He tried once. Twice. Then he began to pound on the door. Simone. Simone, open this door. Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't move from my chair. I simply tapped the microphone icon on my phone. My voice came through the porch speaker, calm and steady, like I was moderating a board meeting. Your things are in the garage, Derek. I've left the side door unlocked for exactly 1 hour. After that, the code will be changed, and I will be calling Sergeant Holloway to report a trespasser. I suggest you move quickly. He froze. He looked directly into the camera lens, his face turning a deep, ugly shade of red. You had me arrested, Simone. In front of people. Do you realize what this is going to do to my career? To my reputation? I could lose my job. You didn't lose your job because of me, Derek, I said. You lost your reputation the moment you decided to steal my car to visit your mistress. Everything that happened last night was a direct consequence of your own choices. I simply provided the documentation. It was a misunderstanding, he screamed, stepping closer to the camera. I was going to explain everything Sunday. I was going to tell you about Tanya. I was just trying to find a way to make it easy on you. Explanations have limits, Derek. You reached yours at apartment 7B. Your hour starts now. I watched him stand there for a long minute, his fists clenched at his sides. For a second, I thought he might actually try to kick the door in. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the realization that for the first time in 12 years, his words had no power. The anchor wasn't holding him in place anymore, it had dropped him into the deep end, and he was finally drowning in his own lies. He eventually turned away, his shoulders slumped, and walked toward the garage. I watched the feed as he loaded those 24 boxes into the back of that rental car. He didn't look like a pharmaceutical closer anymore. He looked like a man who had finally run out of stories. When he pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt a sense of completion. I walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and listened to the click. It was a beautiful sound. The site was cleared. The demolition was over. Now, finally, I could start the real work of rebuilding. You know, some people think that once the locks are changed and the boxes are gone, the story is over. But a marriage of 12 years has roots that go deep into the soil, and pulling them up is a messy, exhausting business. Derek didn't go quietly. A man who has spent a decade winning with words doesn't suddenly accept defeat just because he spent a night in a holding cell. No, he doubled down. The divorce proceedings were a battlefield. Derek's initial legal response was like a work of fiction. He claimed the arrest was wrongful entrapment. He claimed that I had maliciously orchestrated the entire event to gain an upper hand in the settlement. He even tried to argue that the Mercedes was marital property, regardless of whose name was on the title, and that he had a good faith belief that his use was authorized. But Derek made one fatal mistake. He assumed my attorney, Michelle Torres, was going to play by his rules. Michelle was relentless. During the discovery phase, she didn't just look at the car, she went after the money. She subpoenaed Derek's bank records, his corporate travel logs, and his cell phone pings for the last 5 years. And that's when the real Project 2847 came to light. We discovered that Derek hadn't just been cheating, he had been living a double life on a scale I hadn't even imagined. He had a secret credit card where he'd run up $40,000 in debt he tried to claim was marital until Michelle showed that 90% of the charges were at high-end boutiques, lingerie shops, and hotels in cities where he supposedly had conferences. Then came the deposition of Tanya Richardson. I wasn't in the room for it, but I read the transcript. Tanya, it turns out, was just as much a victim of Derek's storytelling as I was. When Michelle sat her down, Tanya admitted, under oath, that Derek had told her he'd been divorced for 2 years. He had even shown her a forged divorce decree. He'd been paying a portion of her rent at the Willows, telling her it was his apartment that they were sharing. He'd used the money he'd siphoned from our joint savings to buy her affection, all while telling me he was short on commissions. When the judge saw the forged decree and the dissipation of assets report Michelle had prepared, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. It's one thing to be an unfaithful spouse, it's quite another to be a fraudulent one. Derek sat at the defense table, his head in his hands, as Michelle presented my GPS logs side by side with his business trip calendar. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who reminded me a bit of my mother, looked over her spectacles at Derek and said, "Mr. Fontaine, your explanations are mathematically impossible. You cannot be in 2 places at once, and you certainly cannot claim good faith when you are carrying a forged legal document in your briefcase." In the end, the settlement wasn't a split. It was a total reclamation. I kept the house in Silver Spring. I kept my retirement accounts. I kept every cent of my partnership earnings. The judge ruled that because of his systematic dissipation of our marital assets, he was entitled to almost nothing. In fact, he was ordered to pay back a significant portion of the money he'd stolen from our joint accounts. The toxic ex-narrative he'd tried to build for Tanya had crumbled. The successful closer image he'd built for the world was gone. By the time the final decree was signed 7 months later, Derek Fontaine wasn't just my ex-husband. He was a cautionary tale in the public record. I remember walking out of the courthouse that final day. The air was warm, smelling of summer rain. I looked at the paperwork in my hand, the final closeout report of a 12-year failed venture. I didn't feel like I'd won a prize. I felt like I'd finally cleared a debt. The war was over, the documentation had held up, and for the first time in a decade, the ledger was balanced. A few weeks after the final papers were signed and the ink was dry on my new life, I was sitting on my back porch, watching the fireflies dance over the garden I'd finally found the time to plant. My phone buzzed. It was my mother. "Simone," she said, her voice carrying that familiar, rhythmic warmth of home. "I have been waiting until the dust settled to ask you something. Now that it is finished, I must know." "What is it, Mom?" "When you tracked that car, when you sat in that house and watched his location for 5 days, and then you walked into that police station, did you know what was going to happen? Did you know it would end like this?" I looked out at the marigolds, their orange petals glowing in the twilight. I thought about the Simone of 10 years ago, the one who would have made an excuse for the smell of Tanya's perfume. "I knew what could happen, Mom," I said softly. I didn't know for certain if the law would see it my way. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the maybe. I just cared about the facts. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her nodding. "Your father and I, we worried about you, you know. Back in 2011, when you brought him to the house for the first time. There was a shadow in him. Something about the way he agreed with everything we said, as if he were studying for a test instead of joining a family." My heart pinched. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" "Oh, Simone," she sighed. "Would you have listened? You were 25 and so in love with the idea of being loved. You were so certain you had found your person. If we had spoken against him, he would have used our words to build a wall between us. We had to stay quiet and pray we were wrong." She paused, and her voice grew firm. "We weren't wrong. But I am not proud of you for being right, Simone. I am proud of you for finally seeing the truth. I am proud of you for documenting it, for protecting the life you worked so hard for, and for realizing that your gut instinct was the best engineer you ever hired. Thanks, Mom." It took me a long time to hear it over all his noise. The truth is never loud, Simone. It is just steady. Remember that. Next time, if there is a next time, trust the quiet voice first. We talked for an hour about the garden, about her clinic, and about the future. When I hung up, I realized that I had spent 12 years trying to build a bridge to a man who was already halfway across a different river. My parents had seen the structural flaws from day one, but they knew that some bridges have to collapse before you can learn how to build on solid ground. I went inside and looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. I didn't see a victim of a 12-year lie. I saw a woman who had survived a masterclass in deception and come out with her assets, her name, and her soul intact. My mother was right. The truth isn't a scream, it's the quiet documentation of the life you deserve. And for the first time in a very long time, I was living it. It has been 18 months since the day Derek's boxes left my garage. If you had told me then that I'd be sitting here today feeling this light, I wouldn't have believed you. I thought the end of a 12-year marriage would feel like a crater. Instead, it feels like a wide-open field. I still work at the firm, but things are different now. I don't stay until 9 p.m. to avoid a quiet house or to overcompensate for the stress Derek used to bring home. I leave at 5:30 p.m. I joined a hiking group. I've started traveling, real traveling, where the only itinerary is what I feel like doing when I wake up. A few months ago, I saw a familiar charcoal gray shape in a parking lot downtown. My heart didn't even skip a beat. I walked toward the Mercedes, my Mercedes, and saw my own reflection in the window. I've kept the car. Not because I need a status symbol, but because it's a reminder. Every time I get behind that wheel, I remember that I am the one in the driver's seat. I am the one who pays the note, the one who knows the destination, and the one who holds the title. As for Derek? The last I heard, he'd moved to a different state. The grand theft charges were eventually downgraded as part of the divorce settlement. Michelle used them as a heavy hammer to get him to sign away the house, but the arrest record is permanent. In the age of Google, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle is a hard thing to explain away in a job interview. Tanya? I don't check her Instagram anymore. I don't need to know if they stayed together or if he's already finding a new anchor to subsidize a third life. She was just another project he mismanaged. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that first night on the balcony. I think about the man who promised me the world and the woman who was so eager to believe him. I don't hate her. I don't even pity her. I just want to tell her that it's okay to look at the math. It's okay to ask for the receipts. It's okay to realize that a whirlwind is just a storm with a better marketing team. My father still washes his car every Saturday morning. Last week, I pulled into his driveway and joined him. We didn't talk about Derek. We talked about the engine, the oil pressure, and the importance of a solid frame. You did good, Simone, he said, handing me a dry towel. The bridge fell down, but look at you. You're still standing. And he's right. I'm still standing. I'm a project manager, after all. I know how to handle a setback. I know how to adjust the timeline. And I know that the most important project I'll ever work on isn't a partnership or a house or a marriage. It's the truth of who I am when the stories finally stop. The project is officially closed. The ledger is balanced. And for the first time in my life, I'm not looking for an explanation. I'm just living the answer.